The story behind Juneteenth, the name, origin, and symbolism behind African American independence. The holiday's 155-year history holds a lot of meaning in the fight for Black liberation today. This year, even as the significance of the holiday is amplified by the renewed fight against racial injustice in America, restrictions stemming from the COVID virus pandemic have had an effect on Juneteenth celebrations. Houston's annual Juneteenth parade have been canceled due to the COVID-19 fears, and other cities and states have followed suit, while some are planning virtual events instead. What is Juneteenth? Juneteenth is a 155-year-old holiday celebrating the emancipation of African Americans from slavery in the United States. It is celebrated on June the 19th. The name is a combination of words June and 19, because on that day in 1865, Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army landed in Galveston, Texas, and informed slaves that the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished. General Granger's announcement put into effect the Emancipation Proclamation, which had been issued more than 2.5 years earlier on January the 1st, 1863, by President Abraham Lincoln. It is African Americans' Independence Day. Juneteenth, also called Emancipation Day or Juneteenth Independence Day, a holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, observed annually on June the 19th. Juneteenth is the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. It's celebrated on Saturday, June the 19th, 2021. Juneteenth is a holiday celebrated on the 19th of June to commemorate the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. The holiday was first celebrated in Texas, where on that day, in 1865, in the aftermath of the Civil War, slaves were declared free under the terms of the 1862 Emancipation Proclamation. On June 19, 1866, 1 year after the announcement of freedom and emancipation for blacks, freedmen in Texas organized the first of what became the annual celebration of Jubilee Day. Jubilee Day, the early celebrations were used as political rallies to give voting instructions to newly freed slaves. By the 1890s, Jubilee Day had become known as Juneteenth. Juneteenth celebration continues to resonate in new ways, given the sweeping changes and widespread protests across the United States over the last year and following a guilty verdict of the killing of George Floyd. The Union Army landed in Galveston, Texas, and informed slaves that the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished. Granger and roughly 2,000 Union soldiers were there to enforce President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which had actually gone into effect more than 2 years earlier on January the 1st, 1863. In fact, Lincoln himself had been assassinated a few months earlier in April 1865. On June the 19th, in Galveston, Texas, Granger publicly read General Order Number 3, which stated, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." Today, there remain varying accounts of why it took so long for the news of slavery's abolition to reach Texas, with one story claiming that the messenger bearing the news was murdered on his way there. However, many historians noted that Texas remained a Confederate state until 1865, when Robert E. Lee finally surrendered to the Union Army, and the state would therefore not have enforced Lincoln's proclamation until the Union took control. Granger's announcement that slavery had been abolished by the federal government kicked off widespread celebrations across the state of Texas. As newly freed Texas slaves began resettling across the country as part of the Great Migration of former slaves, the tradition of Juneteenth celebration also spread to the new locations across the South and the rest of the United States over the next century. However, especially during the post-Civil War Reconstruction and Jim Crow era, former Confederate states had little inclination to recognize Juneteenth, according to the Smithsonian Magazine. As much as the grassroots aspect of Juneteenth celebrations was often the norm well into the 20th century, which contributed to the Juneteenth holiday regularly going unnoticed by Americans outside of the black community. It is still rarely mentioned in school curricula. As a result, this monumental event remains largely unknown to most Americans. Juneteenth remained a major celebration for black communities in Texas. However, in 1938, Texas designated a day of observation for Juneteenth celebrations called Emancipation Day. 2 years after, up to 200,000 people turned out for Juneteenth celebration in Dallas. Still, Juneteenth did not become a national holiday, and it did not become a state holiday in Texas until the 1980s, and the state's government office did not close for the holiday. Juneteenth celebrations is beginning to see a resurgence among the black community in the middle of the 20th century, especially amidst the civil rights movement. In recent years, President Barack Obama had issued statements of observance for the Juneteenth holiday, but efforts to make Juneteenth an official federal holiday had fallen short in Congress. As of 2020, 47 states and the District of Columbia have all passed legislation recognizing Juneteenth as either a state holiday or a day of observance. Hawaii, North Dakota, and South Dakota are the only states that do not recognize the holiday. As per the holiday's tradition, celebrations still often feature some mix of religious services and storytelling, while music, food, parades, and other jubilant celebrations of black culture. as demonstrators across America fight to liberate black people, whether through calls to abolish the police or through legislative action against systemic racism. The country is getting ready to celebrate the 155th anniversary of one of its earliest liberation movements, Juneteenth. In 1865, when a group of enslaved people in Galveston, Texas finally learned that they were free from the institution of slavery, but woefully, this was almost 2.5 years after President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The Civil War was still going on, and when it ended, Union Major General Gordon Granger traveled to Texas and issued an order stating that all enslaved people were free, establishing a new relationship between former masters and slaves as employee and hired labor. As much as Juneteenth represents freedom, it also represents how emancipation was tragically delayed for enslaved people in the deepest reaches of the Confederacy. Juneteenth is still not taught in most schools, nor is the event a federal holiday, despite decades of pushing from activists. In 1980, Texas became the first state to declare Juneteenth an official holiday. In 2020, Washington, D.C. and nearly every state recognized the day as a holiday or observance. During the Civil War, the United States Congress passed the Confiscation Act of 1862, which authorized Union troops to seize Confederate property, including enslaved people. The act also allowed the Union Army to recruit black soldiers. Months later, as the nation approached its third year of the Civil War, President Lincoln, on January the 1st, 1863, would affirm the aims of the act by issuing the final draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. The document declared that all persons held as slaves are and henceforth shall be free. Lincoln wrote, "I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within the designated states and parts of states are and henceforth shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and the naval authorities, therefore, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons." Some Southern slave owners never told the people who were enslaved they were freed. The 13th Amendment, passed by Congress in January 1865, would then leave a new set of challenges for the newly emancipated. The 13th Amendment was not a total freedom. It said, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude should exist except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So there you have it, folks. The 13th Amendment explains that black people are free except if you commit a crime. Then you can be incarcerated and all your rights will go back to the state. In other words, a new type of slavery exists within the penal system. The Juneteenth flag commemorates the day that slavery ended in the United States. The red, white, and blue represents the American flag. A reminder that slaves and their descendants were and are Americans. The star represents the freedom of African Americans in all 50 states. Over the years, Juneteenth has grown into a jubilation of freedom, a time for former slaves and descendants to make a pilgrimage to Galveston, a period for assessment, reflection, self-improvement, and planning for the future. The primary Juneteenth flag is the red, white, and blue, significant for Black people in America being part of America, part of the American flag. There's a secondary flag, the green, black, and red. The red stands for the blood of African Americans. The black stands for the black race. And the green stands for the land. In 2020, weeks leading up to the Juneteenth celebration, a slate of companies, including Twitter and Nike, announced their decision to recognize the day as a paid company holiday. Texas Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, who has released a resolution each year to recognize the historical significance of Juneteenth, had plans to introduce legislation to make Juneteenth a federal holiday.